Welcome. Please come in and we'll get started. And one item of just business, I've received a number of questions about materials from the conference. We'll be posting video and audio and materials, PowerPoints and so forth from the presenters as they give us permission on the conference website, religiousfreedom.byu.edu. So you can look there if you want to be able to see more details about things you've heard and seen today and yesterday. Well, this session is titled Interfaith Cooperation. How can we work together to promote religious freedom? And we have two very distinguished guests. I'm delighted that they would join us. They both have very busy schedules, and Imam is coming in the middle of the Muslim holiday of Eid, and so we're so grateful for him for making time, especially during that. Our first speaker will be Imam Muhammad Musri, who is the senior Imam, president, and chairman of the board of the Islamic Society of Central Florida. He's heavily engaged in public relations, public charities, interfaith and intergovernmental, working with governments on religion, peace, and social issues. For example, he's chairman and president and chairman of the board of Leaders Preparatory School, Horizons Child Care and Learning Center. He's president of the Peace Institute, which conducts outreach programs and services, partnering with various organizations, and is advisor on Islam and Muslims to various agencies of the U.S. government. He's known nationally for his work in interfaith cooperation and peace building, particularly in helping stop a Florida pastor who was seeking to burn copies of the Quran in 2010. There's much more I could say about him, but I think it's probably most appropriate just to let him have the floor. But before I do, I'll go ahead and introduce our second speaker as well, so that we'll hear from both of them without interruption and have questions at the end. Our second speaker is Professor Daniel Mark, who's an assistant professor of political science, Villanova University College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. He also serves as a commissioner on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and was just, this week, selected to be vice chair of that commission. He also is a faculty associate of the Matthew Ryan Center for the Study of Free Institutions and the Public Good. He's been a professor at the Naval Reserve Officers Training Corps, a visiting fellow at Princeton University's Department's James Madison Program on American Ideals. Both of them have long and distinguished careers, and we're so grateful that they made the time to come and speak with us. So first we'll give the floor to Imam Musri and then to Professor Mark.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for having me. This is a dear topic to my heart. For most of my adult life, I've been involved in interfaith work because in my childhood, I grew up, I was born in Beirut and grew up in a mixed neighborhood. Most of my childhood friends were Christians, and it broke my heart when I saw my city there getting into civil war because of politics from the outside, and then I felt that I need to do something about it. So I made it my lifelong mission to do interfaith work and bring people of different faith, especially Muslims and Christians and Jews, together to address our similarities, because often people like to focus on the differences, like to focus on the tremendous similarities between our faith and how we can live our faith and do good work in this world. So when I moved to Florida, I immediately got involved in creating and working with the Interfaith Council of Central Florida, and with other colleagues. Here featured in the picture is Rabbi Stephen Engel and Bishop Noonan and Reverend Fullwider. These are some of what I call the co-conspirators. We we worked to promote interfaith dialogue in our community, and we made in the goals of this organization religious freedom as an important cornerstone of our work, and we constantly advocate for religious freedom with our elected officials, with companies and groups, try to help them understand and implement, because we have very diverse community. And you could imagine we get 55 million visitors every year also, so the customers, the visitors, the tourists, they all come from different countries with different faith, and we try to be as inclusive as possible. I also worked for the past 20 or 22 years with a good friend of mine, an evangelical leader, Dr. Joel Hunter. As a pastor of Northland, a church distributed, Dr. Hunter had instrumental role in opening the door between the Muslim community or the interfaith community and the evangelical community. We have experienced over many years barriers between us and evangelicals who would not sit on the table with us and with other religious communities. And we tried our best, and we succeeded through these personal relationships that we developed. Dr. Hunter is right now plays a role as spiritual advisor to the president and takes that message of interfaith to a more national level too. We work together on many practical projects, and here is one of those called Harmony House, where we got different faith communities together to actually build a home, a habitat for a family with all volunteers working together, Jews, Christians, Muslims, and other faiths. Through that relationship and through seeing the tension between the evangelical community and specifically the Muslim community, Dr. Hunter was able to open other doors for us to reach to some other prominent evangelical leaders to have a conversation. And here is Pastor Bob Roberts from Texas, who as a result called for a retreat, hosted a retreat in Texas, and we brought 15 imams from around the country and 15 top evangelical leaders. And we spent 3 days to develop friendship and to really be very close to each other and have conversations without media and without just leaders one-on-one. We developed a lot of relations through that, understandings about each other. And during this, we came to the conclusion that we have much more in common than different, and that we have to work together to make it better for our world. The Christian leaders complained about Christian minorities in Pakistan and other countries where some churches were burned down, some Christians were attacked in Muslim majority countries. And we talked about what we are experiencing here of mosques being vandalized and Muslims being shot and killed. And we decided to help each other in that respect. So, and this picture was really, we had fun. So we didn't just talk. We had horseback riding, and the first time I went actually, I think it's a Texas tradition that you have to also shoot. Never mind the shooting last night, a tragic of 5 police officers. May God be with them and their families. But I actually brought it up again in another conference. I said, I never shot in my life, and then you took us out there and you start training us how to shoot. So I said, if the FBI is watching me, they will say there was a terrorist camp in Texas. And one of them wanted to take photos. I said, please don't. It will be all over the internet in no time. But from that retreat, we came out with a resolution that we want to really advocate that Muslim leaders are going to make an effort to talk to imams and scholars and leaders in at least Pakistan as a start, where there was a number of churches that were burned or destroyed and Christians were under attack. So we arranged for, as part of the Doha International Center for Interfaith Dialogue, a conference in Doha, Qatar, where we invited 7 imams, top scholars from Pakistan, not just imams, but each one of them had 100,000 imams under their leadership, head of that, and 7 pastors from Pakistan, as well as 7 imams from the United States and 7 pastors from the United States. And it was interesting because there in the conference, the Americans, we sat together, you know, and we were kind of talking. We had more in common with each other, and the Pakistanis had more in common with each other. And then we intentionally had to break it up and make the Muslims, American Muslims, talking to the Pakistani Muslims, and the Christian Americans talking to the Pakistani Christians. And over 3 days, everybody opened up, stated their grievances and concerns and how we can move forward, how to improve the situation, got pledges from these Pakistani leaders who have, you know, hundreds of thousands of mosques and under their leadership, that they have to pledge to protect the Christian churches, and they have to advocate with their government, with their legislatures, to enact laws to protect religious freedom, as well as to take laws, blasphemy laws and other laws that have been used or misused out of the legal system there in Pakistan, that often is used to target individuals who may say something about the Prophet or about the Quran and then end up tangled with the legal system. So we felt that with their size and their influence, if they speak up to this issue, they can influence their elected officials to make actual changes in their laws to expand religious freedom in Pakistan and protect religious minorities, primarily Christians, but there are other minorities. There are Hindus, there are, Ahmadiyya, there's Shia Muslims that are getting also attacked. Also the conference, we decided that the American pastors are going to help using their connections with other evangelical communities and leaders to try to spread the message to protect American Muslims in the United States and mosques by speaking up for us when we are under attack. And you can, this is an example of what they did. I don't know if we have internet here, but I'll try it. So this is in the Baptist Standard. The title here, Defending Religious Minorities Helps Majority Faith Leaders Agree. So they commented on this, and this is going out to many Baptist churches to help them understand that while Christians are majority in this country, they are minorities in many Muslim majority countries. If you, instead of complaining, you protect people here, and we advocate for protection of people there. And that's how we can help each other as faith leaders to promote religious freedom across the world, especially in Muslim majority countries. Now I need your help. You can close it. Okay, so you actually see the screen. What we have here is different. No, I'll just, no? So the idea was we took a one-person-to-person relationship, moved it to more people getting involved, resulted with a retreat, and then that led to a conference internationally in Doha, bringing people of 2 different countries. And then I just want to close this. I want to go back to the PowerPoint. And during the meetings in Doha, we said, we're going to go back to the US and expand this group from 15 on each side, multiplied by 10. Get 150 imams and 150 evangelical leaders to sit together. And it was awkward. It was really awkward. Many of the, for Muslims, it was much easier than for the evangelical leaders, I have to say. But after that conference, it was well received. Many of them didn't realize how much in common we had, and on the good sides. And then they promised to do their work within their communities to stop spreading misinformation or getting people the wrong idea, but to see how they can, in their local communities, reach out to their local imams, the mosques in their area, develop a relationship, just like myself and Dr. Hunter had for many years. And we work on so many issues, homelessness in our communities, poverty, immigration, all kinds of issues. So that's where we took that. We met in Maryland last fall and followed that up with an interfaith gathering at the National Cathedral, where everybody signed a pledge to defend and protect the religious freedom of other people, of people of other faith. So we'll stand up for people of other faith, and other people will stand up for our rights. Doing so, we felt that was a good start in this effort.
We got you back, is it the wrong slide?
Okay. Oh, we.
What slide are you on?
Yeah, keep going. It's about more. Next. Yeah. Okay. We'll stop here. So this was the Washington Conference, and Rabbi David Saperstein is actually U.S. Ambassador at Large for promoting religious freedom, and so we are trying to connect with the government to get more tractions, to get governments, say in Saudi Arabia or Egypt or other countries, to respond. They may not necessarily respond to just religious leaders, coming from the US, but they will be responding to other people. Followed that with, when we realized there are a lot of concerns and complaints by minorities in Muslim majority countries, we worked on putting together a conference in Marrakesh, in Morocco, where a declaration was, after the whole conference and after the presentations of representatives of these minority groups in Muslim lands, they came out with the declaration. Also, you can see it on the Marrakesh Declaration, which is a very helpful step because it was sponsored now officially by the Moroccan king, by the government. So the Moroccan king has good weight with the Saudi king or the Egyptian president or the Turkish, or so now at that level they can push for religious freedom. And this is from the Marrakesh Declaration. It's on their website. Coming back home, we try to promote religious freedom through our radio program, the Friends Talking Faith of the Three Wise Guys, and we call it Good Religion Radio. We try to address issues through to the public, to engage the ordinary people who are not religious leaders. I conclude with this. We are organizing a rally called March for America 2 weeks from now in DC at the National Mall, and to promote religious freedom, to confront extremism, especially I speak for extremism in Islam, and to actually speak against terrorism, want to stop the hate, and we want to reduce the gun violence that is, a problem like we witnessed last night, tragically. That's it. Thank you.
I may be the youngest speaker here, but the good news is I brought everything on paper, so I think we're good to go. No tech for me. I don't even allow students to bring laptops into my classroom, so. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for having me here. I'm thrilled to be back at BYU. I was out here in January for the first time. It was wonderful then. It's wonderful now. Great to be here in the company of so many wonderful people. My dear friends, Brother Rob Howell and Sister Teresa Elwood are here, but I especially want to recognize Sister Sandy Jolly, who's a new colleague of mine on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, just joined us in May, and it's great to have her here and to be working with her in Washington. Of course, I'm honored to be on the panel with Imam Musri. It is nice to see how much we have in common. I, too, recently shot guns in Texas, which is good. I come from New Jersey. It's pretty much impossible to shoot a gun anywhere, so legally. Anyway, thrilled to be here, and I'm quite honored to be participating in this very important event. My topic today is what politics can learn from the family: Jews, Latter-day Saints, and the case for religious freedom. Part 1, mercy. There's a fascinating and disturbing story in chapter 21 of 2 Samuel. At the beginning of the chapter, King David turns to God to learn why Israel has endured 3 years of famine. God informs him that the famine is a punishment for his predecessor King Saul's crimes against the Gibeonites. Saul's connection to the Gibeonites is complicated, but for our purposes, suffice it to say that God held Saul responsible for the deaths of many members of this small tribe living within Israel. David, hoping to bring justice and thereby end the famine, asked the Gibeonites how his kingdom can atone for Saul's sin against them. Grimly, the Gibeonites respond that they wish to see 7 of Saul's male descendants executed and their bodies left on display. David complies. The Talmud, the rabbinic exposition and interpretation of the Bible, cites this story to address the question of why the Gibeonites were one of the few groups who, according to religious decree, were not permitted to convert into Israel. Ordinarily, a Gentile in the non-Utah sense who wants to convert to Judaism is discouraged. That's a Jewish theological thing. Converts are discouraged but permitted. The Gibeonites, however, were under a permanent ban. The rabbis of the Talmud explain, quote, David tried to pacify the Gibeonites, but they would not be pacified. Thereupon he said to them, this nation Israel is distinguished by three characteristics. They are merciful, modest, and benevolent. Only he who cultivates these three characteristics is fit to join this nation, end quote. That is, because the Gibeonites failed to display these qualities, or at least the first one, mercifulness, they were unfit to join the nation of Israel and could not be permitted to convert in. But this is puzzling. Did the Gibeonites do something wrong or not? If they were not entitled to justice against Saul, then why did David go along with it and execute the 7 male descendants? And if they were entitled to justice, then why the ban on their conversion? In other words, if the Gibeonites were entitled to this justice, why were they punished for demanding it? I'd like to address this question by way of an insight about mercy by the philosopher Geoffrey Murphy. Murphy wonders how we can see mercy as an independent concept rather than as a part of justice, or worse, as against justice. Here's the problem. Take, for example, a judge who has to sentence a juvenile who has been convicted of a crime. In deciding on an appropriate punishment, the judge might take into account a variety of factors about the young man's circumstances. That he is only 14 years old, that he comes from an abusive home, that he was pressured into it by a gang, and so forth. We might say in colloquial fashion that this underage criminal deserves some mercy. But as Murphy points out, acknowledging all the relevant factors to ensure the juvenile receives a sentence that is no more than he truly deserves is not an act of mercy. It is justice. Anyone can see that it would be unjust to give this child the same punishment as, for example, an adult who committed the same crime for the sheer sport of it. In contrast, if we think that mercy means giving the juvenile a lighter sentence than he deserves, even taking into account all the mitigating factors, then to be merciful is to commit an act of injustice upon the society that demands and deserves justice against criminals. Much as justice requires meting out to criminals no more than they deserve, it also means meting out no less. If this is mercy, then mercy is unjust. This is how Murphy puts the dilemma, quote, if we simply use the term mercy to refer to certain of the demands of justice, then mercy ceases to be an autonomous virtue and instead becomes a part of justice. It thus becomes obligatory, and all the talks about gifts, acts of grace, supererogation, and compassion become quite besides the point. If, on the other hand, mercy is totally different from justice and actually requires or permits that justice sometimes be set aside, then it counsels injustice. In short, mercy is either a vice or redundant, end quote. To extricate us from this problem, Murphy offers an example from outside criminal law. Suppose you owe me some money. As a matter of justice, I am entitled to claim repayment from you. It is just for me to demand my money back, and it is unjust for you to repay me. In this case, however, there is a place for mercy because while I am entitled to demand payment, I am also free to forgive the debt if I wish. Although a judge commits an injustice if he lets off a convicted criminal who owes a debt to society, I commit no such injustice if I forgive a debt you owe to me. Nothing in justice requires that I forgive the debt, but that is precisely why it is an act of mercy. To put it in the language of rights, we might say that I have a right to demand the money you owe me, but I have no obligation to stand on that right. If I choose, I may relinquish my right and forgive the debt. Legal scholar Suzanne Last-Stone uses this insight of Murphy to answer our question about the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites, victims of Saul's violence, were entitled to justice. They had a right to see Saul punished. At the same time, they did not have an obligation to stand on this right. They could have relinquished it as a people. In mercy, they could have foregone justice. This is why the Gibeonites received their justice but are condemned to remain outside the people of Israel. They lack mercifulness. To stand on one's rights can be at once both just and unmerciful. For this reason, the decree banning the Gibeonites from joining Israel as converts was not exactly a punishment. Justice is the chief virtue of a political community, as the ancient Greeks taught. As a political community, the kingdom of Israel owed the Gibeonites the justice they demanded. To deny them, that would have been unjust. But the people of Israel is not just a political community. The people of Israel is also a family. And in a family, the central virtue is not justice, but mercy. As I said, the Talmud teaches that mercy is one of the three main traits of Israel. Lacking mercy, the Gibeonites were unfit to join this family. Without possessing mercifulness, they could not be in a family, let alone one characterized by this very trait. Thus, their exclusion is not a punishment, but simply a necessary result of their failure to possess this trait. Which brings me to part 2, politics and the family. I would like to elaborate on this distinction between political life and family life. We are all born with God-given, inalienable, natural rights, such as the right to life, the rights to life, liberty, and property. We have laws to protect those rights, and it is the government's job to step in when we are unfairly deprived of our life, liberty, or property. This is what it means to be a citizen in a modern liberal polity, to respect the rights of others and to cooperate in upholding a system that protects those rights. To the extent that we wish for more than that in our shared lives together, it is because we wish to be a part of more than just a bare political community. We want our society to be more like an extended family. But to be in a family is to begin not from a position of standing on one's rights, but from a position of relinquishing them. Those who stand on their rights are fit for membership in a political community, and they are entitled to justice indeed. But they are not fit for membership in a family, like the Gibeonites, who are unfit for membership in the family of Israel. Ultimately, polity and family must be different. If some members of the political community reap the benefits of our common life together without bearing a proportionate share of the burdens, imagine people who benefit from all the usual government services but shirk from their legal responsibilities, then the law can and should step in to rectify the situation. But in a family, burdens are rarely, if ever, distributed evenly or in proportion to the benefits. Parents usually want to make such sacrifices, but acceptance of this maldistribution of benefits and burdens is necessary even when the burdens are unwanted. For example, if one family betrays another, the one who has been betrayed may be entitled to recompense, but such an exacting approach, though perhaps within the bounds of justice, will be bad for family life. This observation applies equally to the mundane circumstances of ordinary life. If one child hogs the bathroom in the morning, it is truly unfair to his or her siblings. They have a right to their fair share time in the bathroom to prepare for their own day. And they have a right to insist that the selfish sibling respect this. But even from that trite example, it is probably plain to everyone here that family relationships are not healthy if they are based first and foremost on who owes what to whom. This is not to excuse or defend selfishness, of course. It is only to say that the political model of justice is a recipe for disaster in family life. There can be no family life if everyone insists all the time on an exact accounting of gains and losses. The family cannot survive if everyone stands on his rights all the time. There cannot be family life without mercy. Despite the inevitable and necessary differences between polity and family, my thesis is first that our political life can be improved through emulating family life in certain ways, and second, that defending religious freedom, now more than ever, depends on this. That is, depends on promoting in society what I'll call the family ethic. Before I turn to religious freedom, let me begin with the first part of my thesis, politics and the family. In a recent speech entitled The Perils of Religious Liberty, Yuval Levin, one of the great public intellectuals of our time, takes a middle position between the critics and defenders of liberalism, and of course by liberalism I mean here more John Locke than MSNBC, namely that liberalism has much to offer in its emphasis on individual liberty, but that in this very emphasis, liberalism can be self-defeating. Personal freedom is incredibly valuable, but it can also erode the bonds of community. Liberty today means individual rights, including the right to be different, the right to leave one's neighborhood, the right to put oneself before the community, and even the right to disbelieve in the very things that create the conditions for this freedom. All of these rights, though important, pose a challenge to the common good. In this way, liberalism, despite its virtues, may subtly but steadily undermine the project of turning our society into a community, into a family. Ironically, a liberal political order both depends upon strong families and communities for supplying what it cannot supply itself, and it undermines them. But I propose that liberalism can be less cannibalistic if society cultivates a family ethic, that is, a culture in which people are inclined to relinquish their rights for the common good, and not only and always stand on their rights for their own good. Legal philosopher Robert Cover wrote that Judaism speaks in the language of duties we owe rather than rights we demand. Perhaps there is wisdom in this for us. Now, I will be the first to say, especially given the work I do, that religious liberty rights must be robustly respected and vigorously defended. But I'm also sympathetic to what Elder Dallin Oaks intended in a speech this past October called "The Boundary Between Church and State," when he said, quote, "I say to my fellow believers that we should not assert the free exercise of religion to override every law and government action that could possibly be interpreted to infringe on institutional or personal religious freedom," end quote. And I think we heard some of this morning. We are entitled, if we wish, to insist on an exact accounting from our fellow citizens in all cases, or in mercy, we can search for compromise. I was struck by a story in the news recently. Someone spontaneously paid for the coffee of the person in line behind her at Starbucks, and the lucky and surprised beneficiary then decided to pay for the coffee of the person in line behind him. And this initiated a chain of giving that went on for hours, to the delight of the employees, the customers, and everyone who flocked to the coffee shop as word spread. Some people think this is just a Starbucks marketing ploy, but the story actually happened, so who knows? But think about it for a second. I'm sure that most of us would buy a cup of coffee for a friend or family member without a second thought. Never mind that the people were pretty much breaking even by giving a free cup of coffee, by getting one and then giving one. What caused so much joy and commotion? A news story in this case. Quite obviously, it was because strangers were treating people well like not strangers. Can you imagine if people treated strangers like family more often? Can you imagine if people were that nice as the rule rather than the exception? Our whole society would be like Utah. You guys are so nice, you know that, right? So nice. Cultivating a family ethic is especially difficult, but commensurately important when it comes to religion and religious freedom. For all of the disagreement that comes with diversity, religion presents a particular challenge because, touching as it does on the things that matter most, it is often the area where we disagree most strongly. This is true about conflict between religions, and nowadays, conflicts between religion and irreligion, which in its contemporary form threatens religion and religious freedom. Given the great diversity of belief and the challenge of disbelief, we need a society that makes room for differing views. This means not only tolerating differences, but also respecting all views held in good faith, even when we disagree. In the earliest days of our republic, President Washington, in his letter to the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island, rejected their reference to tolerance. Quote, "It is now no more that toleration is spoken of," he said, "as if it were the indulgence of one class of people that enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights," end quote. In America, all citizens are equal regardless of their religion, not merely permitted to practice it at the sufferance of the majority. Indeed, as traditional values become increasingly unpopular, we must refrain from playing into the narrative that what we are doing is wrong, though protected. Sometimes when we defend religious freedom, it sounds like we're saying, okay, we'll grant that these beliefs or practices of ours are weird, stupid, crazy, evil. We're just saying that we have a constitutional right to them even though they're weird, crazy, stupid, evil. So please just leave us alone in our little private corner to be the weird, crazy, evil, stupid people that we want to be. As in society, in a healthy family, the differences, not vices, are to be embraced, appreciated, or even celebrated, not merely tolerated. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, former chief rabbi of the United Kingdom and a friend at least of Elder Todd Christofferson, picks up on exactly this comparison between family and society in his book, The Home We Build Together. There, he contrasts a home with a hotel. In a hotel, each person has his own private quarters, and the idea is simply for everyone to reside there without bothering anyone else. There is no common project, and there is only the barest common good. In a home, however, there is a common project and a robust common good, a home they build together. Rabbi Sachs uses this metaphor as a critique of Europe's failed multiculturalism. Under that agenda, each group was to remain distinct in order to retain its distinctiveness. But the result was a society in which different groups were living in parallel, but not truly together. Speaking charitably, we can say that those who build a society like a hotel do it so out of an impulse for justice, protecting the right of each person to his own share of the space. But this does not lay the groundwork for resolving differences, except perhaps through further separation. It does not promote the kind of mutual understanding that enables compromise in the face of persistent disagreement. Perhaps there is a way for the government to provide contraception to every woman who wants it without implicating the nuns of the Little Sisters of the Poor. Perhaps there is a way for the government to grant civil marriage licenses to same-sex couples without implicating bakers, florists, and photographers who don't want to facilitate the celebration of these unions. Perhaps the government can better see the value in not coercing them if it adopts a family ethic. Now, before I move on to the next part of my talk, I want to clarify, put myself truly in the minority here, that I am not endorsing what is known as the Utah Compromise, or at least I am not recommending that others follow suit. I am, you won't be surprised to learn, a disciple of the aforementioned Professor George. After this morning, I thought about throwing all this out and just trying to respond to Mr. Dushku point by point, but lest Tim Schultz jump over the podium and attack me, I thought that instead I would stay with this, which I think is actually the area where we disagree. We may not have full agreement on the political and legal agenda, but I do think we agree a lot on the cultural project. Indeed, having discussed the Utah Compromise with church leaders when I was out here in January, I understand and respect their position that this was the best option for the church and for Utah in the attempt to balance religious liberty with protections for so-called sexual orientation and gender identity. Time will tell. For now, though, I am not convinced that the compromise will hold, and instead it may have sown the seeds of further attacks on our beliefs. And even if it works for Utah, and I most certainly hope it does, I am unconvinced that such an approach will be fruitful. I'm unconvinced that such an approach will be fruitful in other jurisdictions where the left is far more radical and aggressive than it is here in Utah. But I say that just as an aside to avoid misunderstanding within the broader context of proposing that what I say here is part of a cultural project that we in fact agree on and can work on together. And so I move on to my next part. How can our society become more like a family and thereby put religious freedom on firmer footing? Religious freedom is secure when it is firmly ensconced as a right, but nowadays, when it seems less and less a right, it can only be secure in a society that not only protects in law, but respects in culture religious difference. So how do we cultivate a family ethic of genuine accommodation rather than exacting strictness? Well, how do we do it in the family? Not to put too fine a point on it, but I think America needs family home evening. To be sure, American families need family home evening, but I mean a family home evening for society. Think about why family home evening works. I mean, you should really tell me, but I have some guesses, in part because we have something not too far off in the Jewish tradition. Every Friday night, essentially without exception, the family gathers for the traditional festive Sabbath meal. One might say that the central image of the Sabbath is the family gathered around the Sabbath table. Nearly every Jew who grew up in a good observant home must remember Sabbath meals as among his or her most formative childhood experiences. As President Monson once said, quote, "The lessons learned in the home are those that last the longest," end quote. Shared activities at the Sabbath meal, not just eating, but religious songs, grace, discussion of the weekly Bible portion, forge bonds within the family. Moreover, with no distractions, televisions, phones, cars, and much else are prohibited. Simply the time together, being present in the moment in the contemporary parlance, does wonders. Like with family home evening, it matters less what you do than that you do it. But how can a society do a family night? The key, I think, is like with family home evening, is for people to spend quality time together. This is why a vibrant civic culture, complete with neighborhood picnics and rec leagues and volunteer associations, is so important. There is much truth to the cliche that if only people got to know each other, they would respect each other much more. My aim is not to prescribe a specific plan, but to suggest that we must redouble our efforts to engage our fellow citizens intentionally outside of the contentious political arena and the impersonal marketplace. Latter-day Saints, of course, are probably better at this than most. By the same token, we must emphatically reject, and I may make more enemies here, what some Christians call the Benedict option, a strategic retreat from engagement with the culture in order to preserve the faith against the latest assaults. There are many reasons why the Benedict option is the wrong path, but for our purposes, the problem is that we cannot cultivate mutual respect among all citizens. We cannot cultivate the family ethic if we retreat behind the monastery walls. If our fellow citizens do not encounter us, they cannot understand us, and vice versa. To be absolutely clear, this is certainly not a criticism of BYU or Utah or the church. The best-known expositor of the Benedict option today is Rod Dreher, the cultural commentator and columnist. A common joke is that no one really knows what he means by the Benedict option and that Dreher himself is writing a book about it so that he can figure out what he means. But here's what he says, quote, "Christians who allow this rotten culture to catechize them and their children are going to lose their faith. There is no choice but to withdraw into our own institutions and communities where we can form the next generations. I was emailing earlier today with a well-known public intellectual who is a committed Christian. I often wonder how he manages to find the strength to take on the battles he fights in the public square. I found out from him today that he has a long history of youth formation with thick Christian communities. Of course he does. He works in the heat of battle in the public square. He would have been wiped out long ago if not for his formation in the faith. The same is true for us and our children." End quote. If this is what Dreher means, that we need to form our children in religious communities with religious schools and religious summer camps, then I am all for it. In that case, the Benedict option is nothing new. Rather, it's what Orthodox Jews have been doing all along and should keep doing, and it's what the church should do wherever possible. The question, though, is what this plan means for our engagement with the wider world. If we provide our children with a strong formation in order to enable them to go out into the world and engage with politics and culture, like the committed Christian Dreher describes, then we are doing it right. And surely the church, again, is the best example of this. If, however, the withdrawal means building walls around our communities and institutions while the world burns down around us, then we are doing it wrong. Part 4, religious freedom. I have been arguing that we need to bring the family ethic into our politics and culture. In this respect, the family serves society as an analogy. We ought to strive for a society that is more like a family. Now for a twist. The proper relationship between society and family is not just analogical. The family is not just an example for society. The family is also the primary building block of society. The family is the first place, and typically the primary place, where children learn the virtues necessary to be good citizens. It would be impossible for the government to enforce every violation of the law, or at least we would not want to live in the kind of place, in the kind of police state where the government would be capable of doing so. The IRS can only audit a small percentage of all tax returns, so the government depends on most people paying most of their taxes most of the time honestly. In other words, our system depends on the family and the church teaching people to be disciplined, industrious, and honest, to say nothing of generous. As Elder Oak said in that same speech I quoted before, those skeptical or hostile to believers and their organizations should recognize the reality borne out by experience that religious principles and teachings and their organizations are here to stay and can help create the conditions in which public laws and government institutions and their citizens can flourish. Our society is not held together primarily by law and its enforcement, but most importantly, by those who voluntarily obey the unenforceable because of their internalized norms of righteous or correct behavior." End quote. This is precisely how the family functions as well. The smooth functioning of the family depends on members doing the right thing because they're committed to the common good of the family, not because they'll be caught and punished. If it were the latter, each person would cheat the others when he thought he could get away with it, and much damage would be done. Instead, each family member contributes to the common good through self-restraint and hard work, largely without promise of reward or fear of punishment. In learning to be good members of the family, they thus also learn to be good citizens in society. And this brings me to the final point. We have spoken of the family as an analogy for society, and we have spoken of family and religion working in similar ways for the benefit of society as schools of virtue. So let me close with a third connection, this time between the family and religious freedom specifically. Religious freedom is critical not only because it allows us to live out our strange beliefs in a remote corner of society, but also because it allows us in our public witness to proclaim a moral vision for the family, for our communities, and for the world. If I may speak for the Christian faith for just a moment, religion isn't just about how we should live, it's about how everyone should live. And to draw in our earlier theme, it turns out that the call to virtue, as the founding fathers knew so well, that the call to virtue is necessary for sustaining a republic, particularly in an age of individual rights and Facebook and the selfie. To quote Yuval Levin, we need to see that we are defending more than religious liberty. We are defending the very idea that our government exists to protect the space in which various institutions of civil society do the work that enables Americans to thrive. And we are defending the proposition that this work involves moral formation and not just liberation from constraint. End quote. So let us take our example from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and perhaps from the Jews. Our task is first to build strong families that sustain our republic by producing responsible citizens and by serving as models for the rest of society. And second, to carry the family ethic out into the world. Family home evening, coming to a neighborhood near you. Living out our mission certainly requires religious freedom, but done well, it will also foster a society that honors religious freedom. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a delight to share your experiences and insights. We have just a couple minutes, so we'll take a few questions, and maybe I'll gather 2 or 3 questions before we'll let the speakers have the floor. We have microphones going up. Do we have questions? Yes, there's a woman over here. Thank you.
Okay, my question, excuse me, probably towards Professor, is it Mark? In talking about moving the family ethic at a national level or political level, I was thinking that a family usually has an identity, and I think maybe nationally we're struggling with the identity that we originally started with our founding fathers. Would you be able to comment on that?
Thank you. Maybe we could just take 2 or 3 questions since we're going to be short on time. Can we take 1 more or 2 more questions? Yes, in the back corner up here. Grace, behind you. Oh, there's one right there, please.
What efforts do you see as irreligion being established as a religion? And what do you say is the solution according to Interfaith and this FHE idea?
Okay, and there was 1 more question up in the back. I hope I'm not imposing on our panelists too much.
My question is kind of directed at Professor Mark because I feel like in the first talk there were a lot of examples of ways to interact in the community, to bring religious values in a positive way into our community. But with Professor Mark, I imagine that you have multiple scenarios in mind when you're talking about applying mercy in our community and bringing the family values into our community. And I wonder, just for you, what are those like practical, specific, like real life scenarios that an individual or a family can do that?
Thank you. Maybe we'll give you, the panelists, a couple moments, and I'll use my moderator's prerogative to go a few minutes over the regular time. You have to hold that up really close to your mouth. Is that on?
Just needed a review of the question, if that's all right.
The second question.
I'm not sure, there's no light.
If you wouldn't mind repeating your question.
What efforts do you see being made to establish irreligion as a religion, and what solution do you propose according to interfaith and this societal familial FHE idea?
Okay, well, and since I ate up all the time with my speech anyway, I'll try to be super quick in answering some of the questions. On the subject of national identity, I think you're right. We are struggling in part because we've lost some of that sense from the founding, and I think the answer is to try to recover it. This goes back to so many of the problems we face. I think if we dig all the way down to the problems that we face in this country, we're going to get down to the family. The breakdown of the family, I think, is the core of it. But we have a lot of problems in education, right? Students don't know civics. They don't really know what America is about or why it's worth appreciating, why it's worth defending. So to that question, I would just acknowledge your premise and say, I think you're right. I think it means better education about what America is. Now, not to elevate national identity not to elevate it over religious identity, right? The church, religion comes before the state, but we do live in a great country, and there are a lot of great principles from the founding that can serve as the kind of thing that people organize around together. Now, why we've lost it and what to do about it, that's for a longer discussion, I think. With respect to irreligion, I think we see it. I think we see the Church of Secularism everywhere. It would be, you need a whole day just to go over that. But think about the way, ask yourself whether you think the government is in fact neutral between religion and irreligion, right? So what does the First Amendment, which singles out religion for special protection, also in the same way single out religion for special disfavor? Does this Establishment Clause of the Constitution mean that religion should be crowded out of the public square to the favor of every other ideology and belief? So I think it's really all around us. Now, as far as what can be done, this is kind of what the point is. One thing is you guys got to evangelize more. I know you're working hard, but it's people part of. So on July 12th, right? So it's this coming week on Tuesday. So the Heritage Foundation, conservative think tank in Washington, is releasing its annual, what they ever call the index of something, and the chapter that I wrote the introduction to is on religious attendance. And religious attendance is down in America over the last 10 years. That won't surprise you. Everybody knows that the fastest rising religious group in America is the nuns, N-O-N-E, the people who check off none on the survey of what religion you believe in. And I'm quite worried because I think I think what I write there is that I think it's true that people who don't appreciate religion, don't appreciate religious freedom. At best, they see religion as the freedom to be bigoted, and that's what I was talking about before. So I think that we need more religious people, or we need ways, and one of the main things I think I agree with from this morning from Mr. Dushku is that we need to tell stories. We need to help people understand, even if they're not religious themselves, how religion is part of our story. And with respect to I wrote down on the third question, civic events. Examples for mercy and encounters. So part of it, I say, is it's not the family home evening idea isn't just about exercising mercy. It's just about getting together, and that could be participating in civic events. It could be a 4th of July parade, but it could also be bowling leagues and, from the famous Robert Putnam Bowling Alone sort of thing, just encountering fellow citizens, as I say, outside of politics, which is very contentious, and outside of the marketplace, which is very impersonal. And as far as mercy, the examples I gave were the government the government might, under the law, find a way to say that it can force the Little Sisters of the Poor to provide contraception, but it probably shouldn't. How we can provide mercy in our own lives, I think, again, thinking about when is it possible for us, without sacrificing our integrity, to give our fellow citizens whom we disagree with, more breathing space? And it's hard to figure that out. As I said about the Utah Compromise, I'm very, very suspicious of what's going to come down the road once we enshrine these things in law. I think what becomes an anti-discrimination clause today will be a suspect class the next day. But I do think that short of putting it in the law, we can certainly find much more space in our communities to let people do things that we disagree with.
Thank you. Would you want to make a comment? All right. We'll take one or two more questions, all right, and a break for lunch up here in the back. Well, while we're running the mic all the way up there, why don't we take a good question over here?
Something I've deliberated about that you mentioned was how we should not just protect values but respect them in culture. But you also talked about florists and bakers not being obligated to support a union that they don't support. Where do you draw the line, or how should we address that?
Okay, there was another question up there.
My question was for Imam Musri. I don't know if I'm saying your name right. You mentioned some surprising things that you had in common with the pastors that you both discovered and were surprised about. And I wondered if you could share some of those surprising things. When I listened to you yesterday, there were a lot of things that I've heard Mormon bishops say that when you talked about your congregation and your challenges. So I was just curious what some of those common things were.
And there was one more question right there, yes.
I'm just curious of what kind of precautions do we need to put in place as we're talking about the big picture to protect us from the Marxist approach to government, where the state becomes God.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we'll turn these over to our panelists. Do you want to start?
Well, I'm going to address some of the examples. The Muslim community is very conservative, and the evangelicals are very conservative, and we talked a lot about family values, and we kind of, on Sunday over breakfast, we went over a competition who is more conservative. I said, honestly, the way women go to church, the way they're dressed, we can't let them in the mosque that way because we want to dress covered, men and women, when going to the mosque. The mosque is a holy place, and you need to be as conservative as possible. And I said, well, Mary used to dress more like we do. So we went on who could claim Mary and Jesus more. And said, no, we love Jesus more. I said, we love him alive. You love him crucified. Said, we believe in him as is, but you believe that he must have been crucified to wash your sins. We believe he wasn't crucified, but he is alive in heaven, and on and on. So to the conservative evangelical, their concerns is maybe the Muslims are coming to change our culture and make it more liberal. And I said, no, we don't drink, we don't smoke, we don't, all of these are no-nos. And so as we discovered more how much we have in common, how we interpret the commandments a little bit more strictly as they are in the New Testament, it was said to the men of old, you shall not commit adultery. And I tell you, if you look at a woman with lust, you already commit adultery in your heart, and say, this is how we like to see it. We want to keep it that way. And said, for us, we look at, the conservatism that you're claiming and say it's not conservative enough. But without, taking away the fairness and justice and equality between men and women and so on. But to them, many of them like to emphasize in every other word Jesus. I said, we love Jesus, and Jesus is in the Quran 33 times, more than Muhammad himself, which was mentioned only 5 times. So said every Muslim, every kid knows Jesus, and I I have a little son named Jesus too.
To this gentleman's question on the florists, bakers, and photographers, so I think the first step is that, and I'm all for rights. I mean, on the International Religious Freedom Commission, we try to advocate for people's rights all over the world. And I do think those people's rights should be protected in law. They should be recognized by the courts, as they have not been. All those people have lost so far when they've gone to court, and that's a really big problem. And I think the right answer on that is so clear to us, because if we just picked an example that we were sympathetic to, it wouldn't be hard to see, right? So you go to the Jewish baker and ask him to bake a cake with a swastika on it, or you go to the Muslim baker and you ask him to bake something with a profane picture of Muhammad on it, or something like that, right? And nobody thinks, I don't know anybody who thinks that we should, or almost none. This came up in it. Could you go to a woodworker in an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, ultra-Orthodox Jewish neighborhood of Jerusalem, and ask him to carve a statue of Jesus or something that he thinks is idolatrous? And the courts in Israel wonder, yeah, we might have to do that. And that seems insane to me, that we can't stop short, especially, again, when we put in the full picture of there's no shortage of florists or bakers or photographers. It's about seeking out someone to make a point, right? This is why Memories Pizza, the pizza store in Indiana, right? Nobody has ever gone to that pizza store, perhaps any pizza store before, to ask them to cater a wedding. And yet an enterprising reporter went into Memories Pizza and said, if someone came to you, the pizza store, and asked you to cater a same-sex wedding, would you do it? And then they said no, and then there were boycotts and death threats and all this kind of thing, right? So I mean, I know I'm being like I'm picking examples from one side, but that's not the kind of thing where people need to or ought to press their rights. And I'm not sure that there's a right to conscript someone who provides a service into providing that kind of service for you. Now, it's complicated. Obviously, we went through a similar thing with issues of racism, and we need much more time to talk about the substantive distinction there. But then, of course, it goes on the other side, too. Without ever condoning or celebrating behavior and choices that we think are right, of course, we need to learn how to speak to our fellow citizens in a language of love. And that's obviously something that religious people have not specialized in particularly well over the course of history, speaking to opponents in love. But I think in the recent decade, given the political realities, I think churches, synagogues, mosques, religious groups have done amazing jobs trying to change the way they speak and think, though perhaps not enough, and not enough yet. So there's more work to be done. I don't want to pretend that all this talk was just about how the other side doesn't show enough mercy or something like that. But right now, it's not. The culture wars are not symmetrical right now, right? We have one side pressing in for changes from the status quo, encroaching on the side of the other. So my commentary on it is not going to be symmetrical. And yet, of course, it's to recognize that there can only be a family ethic if both sides are contributing.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking our participants in our panel today.